Good morning, class, and welcome to week 6 of Introduction to Philosophy, where we begin our second unit of the course having to do with nature of world. So here's where we take on broader metaphysical and epistemological questions, going beyond the narrow focus on personal identity or selfhood. And we begin this journey into the second unit of the course, where again we'll be undertaking significant questions from metaphysics and epistemology. We're going to begin this adventure with Plato, and we've already discussed Plato at the beginning of the course, but now we're taking our point of departure as one of Plato's middle works, perhaps his most famous, the most famous of his dialogues, known as the Republic. And like all of his dialogues, there's some central theme or focus that the participants of the conversation are keen to illuminate or unpack. And in this case, the central object of investigation is the nature of justice. But there is this interesting little interlude that appears in books 6 and 7. So our reading for this week is taken from the middle of book 6, and then we get roughly the middle of book 7. In book 6, we get the famous divided line analogy, which we'll work through in just a few moments. And then in book 7, we get the allegory of the cave, which as an allegory or a metaphorical kind of outlining of a particular metaphysical and epistemological thesis, or even as a thought experiment, it's the most famous to emerge in the Western philosophical tradition. And there's so much to be said about the allegory of the cave. And you can analyze it and unpack what's conceptually at work here in the story from a variety of perspectives and registers. So the nature of knowledge and education, the possibility of freedom, achieving self-determination, the nature of reality as such, which is kind of the thematic lens we're going to stay with primarily. So the major conceit, despite all the various ways we can take up a discussion or conversation, the allegory of the cave, the major point is that reality is not what it seems. Let's take a look at the Cave Schematic, which I made available on our Moodle page. So I'm not going to rehearse the entire account of the allegory. So it's in our reading, and there's also a brief 7 or 8 minute kind of trippy animation that you can find that's also embedded in week 6 of our Moodle page. But this is the Cave Schematic, which focuses on the possibility of freedom and also how that possibility is connected to the nature of learning or education. So we begin in stage 1 with the Troglodytes, that is with the cave dwellers. And we can understand this as a kind of obsession with things. Things in this instance being the shadows. So the prisoners within the cave are entirely engrossed in what they encounter, which is limited to the shadows that are projected on the wall. And Socrates says, in no way would they consider anything else to be true except for the shadows. And in parentheses next to true, I have unhidden there, because if you recall our discussion, especially from last week, the idea of truth for the Greeks is articulated through this notion of aletheia, which literally means unhiddenness or uncoveredness. So what is true is uncovered. And that's quite fascinating for us because it suggests that more original, more essential than the uncovering through which truth happens is the prior condition or state of hiddenness, right? So you might say something like untruth or falsity is more essential than the truth as such, which occurs as an event only on the basis of the possibility of that original condition of darkness or obscurity. Now in the story, one prisoner is allowed to turn around, so the chains are removed or loosened, and in virtue of that capacity now to turn, a kind of incipient transformation gets going, and some freedom has been achieved. So now the prisoners can see behind them, as the story goes, along the raised walkway or platform, or the various shadows, or excuse me, statues that are brought along it, from which are created the negative images of the figures. In other words, shadows, which are projected because of the illumination brought about by what we might understand here as the little human-made sun. So the fire that was kindled within the cave in order to make this projection possible. Yet there is a kind of pain involved here because the prisoner's eyes aren't adjusted to even the subtle light of the fire. And so it's kind of painful, and they can't even initially see the figures that are presented in the light of the fire from which the shadows are created, because their eyes are straining to make out the forms and the outlines. And so then, because of this condition of pain, they take the shadows and their unhiddenness to be more unhidden, more true, that is to say, than the figures, which are the originals in terms of the copy-original relationship that we might understand that of the shadows and the figures that create them to be. So now in the second stage, there is a kind of openness to the human world, at least, in which things show up. So the prisoners are removed from the cave and some freedom has been achieved. The prisoners now see this little human-made sun, which unhides the puppets or the figures of the statues. In stage 3, you get this openness beyond human opinion. So the prisoner is now released into the wholly open, beyond the confines of the cave. And the suggestion here is that freedom or liberation is not simply the removal of chains, inasmuch as that already occurred back in stage 1, but rather real freedom begins as the continuous effort to fix one's gaze on the firm limits of things. And those limits are defined in terms of what the things are and how they come to presence or present themselves in their truth, in their revelation, regardless of this or that narrow, experientially grounded and confined human opinion or judgment. So that's the third stage, in which now the freed prisoner is able to see not only the essential falsity of the shadows, but a kind of derivative falsity too of the figures, which are the conditions of possibility for even the projection of the shadows. So along the raised platform, the shapes that are cast in shadowy form on the wall, you have maybe a human figure brought along, a tree, a dog, a chair, a ship, a house, and so forth. So these are more original, these are more true, that is to say, than the shadows, which are derived from them in a negative fashion because of the interruption of the light, right? That's how shadows work. But then the figure itself, the statue itself of the human or the tree or the ship or the house are themselves ultimately copies or derivative products based on the original of some actual tree out there in the world, or human figure or ship or house, of which the statues or the puppets within the cave space are themselves copies, right? But this isn't where the story ends. This is simply the third stage out of 4. Now, as we learn from the account, the prisoner, by virtue of duty, you might say, has to return to the cave. And so we find a kind of repetition of the first stage of this ascent. So now, after the completion or success of the ascent from outside of the cave, or rather to outside of the cave, there is a reciprocal and equally necessary descent. So a return to the obscurity, darkness, in other words, untruth or falsity of the cave realm. But nevertheless, a significant transformation has taken place. So we should understand the cave world, that in which the dwellers or troglodytes or prisoners are compelled to live obliviously, as our world, So Glaucon tells Socrates, these are strange prisoners, these are strange figures, strange people. And Socrates responds, yes, and they are us. We are strange. And so the cave world, a kind of world or realm of illusion or deception, is the only one that we have available to us, at least as we exist as biological creatures within the physical realm. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, which is where we find Socrates eventually compelled to drink the hemlock, and he dies at the end of the account. But in the Phaedo, it's really this protracted discussion between Socrates and his followers about the possibility of survival past bodily death. And here the body is characterized as a kind of prison in which our souls are confined. And when we die, and death is defined literally as the separation of soul from body, we are freed to escape what you might understand. Now, bringing this into context with the cave allegory, to escape our cave world of illusion. But the cave is our only world in which we can live, and we can't get rid of in a final achievement, in a total way. The darkness of the cave, one then as the returned prisoner can only strive to show that it in fact is a cave, that it is, in other words, dark, that it is a source of falsity, illusion, obscurity, and deception. And so this is the only thing that separates the first stage from the fourth stage. Now, if the freed prisoner is successful in liberating, so to speak, his or her fellow prisoners, he doesn't do so by removing them from the cave world, but instead revealing it as precisely what it is, this cave world, and thus a kind of ineliminable source of deception and illusion. And so we can point out then, as I mentioned early on in this course, that we are biased in certain ways, that we have prejudices, that we have presuppositions that don't quite square necessarily with the order of things. And we can never escape this. This is the nature of human finitude. All we can hope to do is to reveal reality as such, as in fact obscure and an ongoing source of deception, or a process of laying snares for our credulity, you might say. And there are pointed, deliberate efforts on the part of cultural, economic elites and so forth to keep the status quo precisely in place, which isn't just the status quo of the deceptive cave world, but its outward presentation or illumination as such a deceptive and irreparably so illusory cave world. So I'm going to stop this video since we're almost out of 15 minutes of time. I'm trying to create these videos in accordance with, but there will be part 2 of the video in which we'll walk through some other important implications, and we'll talk in more detail about Plato's two-world metaphysics, and we'll ground that in the divided line analogy from Book VI of the Republic, and also in a more detailed fashion, the allegory of the cave that arises from Book VII.